Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. That's Film Stories. Film Stories, remember?
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
The story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the bits and bobs, those ingredients really that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover in this podcast, they're more of a mainstream leaning than anything. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. I'm just interested in celebrating the fact that films get made and it's not really that easy to do so. I think that's enough preamble, though. I'm going to crack on with the first of the two films I'm talking about in this episode. I'm going back to 1997. I'll play you a clip from the trailer. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
On the campus of one of America's leading universities.
There is a problem on the main hallway chalkboard. It took my colleagues and I more than 2 years to prove it. I'm hoping that one of you might prove it by the end of the semester.
The most gifted mind to ever enter its classrooms.
This is correct. Who did this?
Is the person who cleans its floors.
I just need the name of this guy who works in my building.
Got this job through his PO, you can call him.
P.O.?
Parole officer.
Meet Will Hunting.
I've been looking over this rap sheet of yours. Assault, theft, resisting.
I've spoken to the judge, and he's agreed to release you under my supervision.
Really?
But you have to meet with a therapist every week.
That's pretty good.
For the first time in his life, he's about to meet his match.
How many shrinks you go to before me?
5. This boy's genius is unparalleled. I need someone who can get through to him.
Yeah, let's do it. I'm pumped. Let's let the healing begin. I went on a date last week.
And that then is a clip from 1997's Good Will Hunting, directed by Gus Van Sant, written by Ben Affleck and Matt Damon, starring Ben Affleck and Matt Damon, along with Robin Williams, Stellan Skarsgård and Minnie Driver. And let's go back to the 1990s and the model for independent films that was just burgeoning at that point, that people were getting to a point where they could write and make their own things. People like Richard Linklater with his film Slacker, Kevin Smith with Clerks, and as Matt Damon would cite when talking about Good Will Hunting, even people like Sylvester Stallone going back even further when he wrote the original Rocky film and then insisted on starring in it. So there was a path there, and it's Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, then unknowns, who are at the heart of this particular story, because the pair of them grew up in the Cambridge area of the US, and their paths crossed when they went to drama classes together. But then ultimately, when it came to higher education, they went their separate ways. Damon in particular, he went off to Harvard University, and in class he was asked to write a one-act play. He didn't do that task particularly well, though. He would instead scribble down some 40 pages of the first act of a film. And his professor at Harvard, a man called Anthony Kubiak, he saw something in it. Now, at this time, both Damon and Affleck were auditioning for films. Affleck at this stage was already in Los Angeles, and Damon had landed a role in the film Geronimo, an American legend. So he went to Los Angeles, slept on his friend's floor, and he had the nucleus for something in the story that he was telling, Good Will Hunting. But he started talking to Ben Affleck about it, and he figured he had one act, and the two of them took it from there. So he asked Ben Affleck to take a look, and they started working on it, and over time they changed it an awful lot. Now, they were in contact with a man called Chris Moore, who himself had just started to produce films, and a lot of this story is told in an excellent Boston magazine oral history that takes some digging to find online, but it's very worth doing. I've leaned on it quite a lot for the telling of this story. They got the script to Chris Moore, And by this stage, Affleck and Damon had reworked it a lot, and they would say that the only scene really that survived that original 40-page document that Damon had put together was the bit where the character Will meets Robin Williams' character Sean for the first time. And so Affleck explained to Boston Magazine about its evolution. He said, we came up with this idea of the brilliant kid and his townie friends, where he was special and the government wanted to get their mitts on it. And the touch points they were talking about at this stage were films like Midnight Run and Beverly Hills Cop. And it was the idea of kids from Boston giving the NSA the slip. And he said, we would improvise and drink like 6 or 12 beers or whatever, record it with a tape recorder. And at the time, we imagined the Professor and the Shrink would be Morgan Freeman and Robert De Niro. So they would do impressions of Freeman and De Niro. And Affleck would say it was kind of hopelessly naive and probably really embarrassing in that respect. But he did touch on something that they'd realised, and this was something that Quentin Tarantino had really shone a light on a way forward, in that the idea of writing a meaty supporting role for that would tempt a major Hollywood talent. I'll come back to this shortly, but just think of how Reservoir Dogs lured Harvey Keitel in, and that helped get that low budget film funded. I mean, Reservoir Dogs was only $1.5 million, but Harvey Keitel was pivotal to getting that off the ground. It lured it in with a meaty role and a good script. Now, let's go back to Charles Moore, because he liked the script and he started trying to sell Good Will Hunting around Hollywood. Now, the draft that Affleck and Damon had come up with, they got into a workable state in 1994, and an agent by the name of Patrick Whitesell got involved. Now, by this stage, Affleck had picked up an acting credit or two, but they were still unknowns in Hollywood, which made their request really quite daring, because Whitesell, following the Rocky template, put the script out to market to Hollywood studios and production companies with the condition that Damon and Affleck must star in the film. That the pair weren't necessarily interested in the money, they wanted to be in their movie. They saw that there were other opportunities, non-financial, through getting this off the ground. Now, in theory, it should be easier to say than to sell, the idea of this script with two unknowns as a condition of it. But they got some traction fairly quickly, because the script was really good and meetings were starting to happen. And within a week, Good Will Hunting had sold. Now, there was still a long way to go, because the company that originally bought it was Castle Rock. Now, Castle Rock was co-founded and co-run by Rob Reiner, who was directing films like A Few Good Men and Misery around this time. That he was just about to do North, I think, with Bruce Willis. Remember that? The one where Bruce Willis is a great big pink bunny. If you don't believe me, go and look it up. Now, Castle Rock came in with an offer reportedly around $600,000. The deal was done. Affleck and Damon thought they'd made it. How easy was this? They'd sold their first script within a week. They got the money. They were able to use the report in Variety to get a deposit on, basically to get collateral to rent a nice apartment. And they thought that was it. But they hadn't. Because the script that Castle Rock had bought was very different to the one we ultimately got. And it was Rob Reiner who looked at it and said, you've basically got two films here. You've got a thriller with two characters against a government agency. And that was a very strong running thread throughout the original Good Will Hunting script. And then there's the other story, which is the story of a maths genius and his shrink. And so Castle Rock and Reiner told them basically to pick which story they wanted to tell. Now, Reiner also brought in Hollywood screenwriting legend William Goldman, Oscar winner, of course, and his list of credits is extraordinary. But in the case of Reiner, he'd adapted Stephen King's book Misery for Rob Reiner, and Goldman had a look at it. Now, this would lead subsequently to some Hollywood rumours that Goldman had basically rewritten the script, and he clarified this in his excellent book, What Lie Did I Tell?, where he said that basically he'd agreed to take a look at it, and he doubled down on Reiner's advice. So you've got to choose which story of the two in your film you want to tell. And so Damon and Affleck, they went back to the script and they decided to dispense of the government and the NSA and the two people up against it story, and to zero in on this idea of a maths genius and his shrink. So it wasn't quite square one they went back to, but it was square 4 or 5, because they basically excised half of their film and they needed to flesh it back out. Now, so they did the rewrite. Castle Rock still interested, although names that were being bandied around at that point, they were looking at people like Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt to take the leads of the film, but Affleck and Damon, they wanted to be acting in this as well. Now, they did have, through Ben Affleck, a way to get to legendary auteur director Terrence Malick, who he hadn't quite got back to making films again after Days of Heaven and Badlands. He'd gone to do The Thin Red Line not long after Good Will Hunting. But they went and had a chat with Malick. They were able to have a sit down with him. And whilst Malick didn't read the script, as Damon told The Times, they explained the story to them, and he would suggest that Malick's contribution to this would be suggesting the ultimate ending to the film, which I'm not going to spoil here, but short of the fact it involves a car journey, and that came from that conversation with Malick. Now, Castle Rock were happy with the script, but then Affleck took it a little step too far by saying they wanted to direct it themselves as well. Who would have thought Ben Affleck could direct films? It'd be a good, 10, 15 years afterwards, he'd win an Oscar for it, but let's gloss over that. Perhaps understandably, given that they were new to Hollywood, Castle Rock just thought that was a step too far. And so it was backing out of the project. And it agreed a deal with Affleck and Damon that they could go and shop the film elsewhere around Hollywood. They would have 30 days to find a new buyer. If they couldn't sell it, it would go back to Castle Rock at the end of those 30 days. And Ben Affleck and Matt Damon would no longer be guaranteed to star in the picture. That was the deal. Would they take the gamble? Well, they were in their early 20s. Of course they took the gamble. And Affleck said, because Affleck talked about the number of rewrites that they did. He said, we were so frustrated that Castle Rock wasn't reading the script. And so they started weaving in little things into it. And this is how they knew Castle Rock's interest was waning, really. And he said, we felt we had to develop this test, and we started writing in screen direction, like, quote, Sean talks to Will and unloads his conscience, and then Will takes a moment and then gives Sean a soulful look and leans in and starts, how do I put this in a family-friendly podcast, starts examining his nether regions with his mouth. How's that? Can I get away with that with PG? I'm cracking on before anyone tells me otherwise. They were putting things like that in the script to see, like, not at the start, but 40, 50 pages in, to see if anyone would notice. They weren't noticing. They knew Castle Rock wasn't reading the rewrites that they kept doing. And so, they thought, let's take this back out to market. But this time, whilst there was interest first time around, there certainly was nowhere near the interest second time, especially with this condition. They would be starring in the film. And the turning point here was Kevin Smith, who by this stage Ben Affleck had just made Chasing Amy with him. And they asked Smith if he would like to direct the film. And Smith he would say, Ben Affleck and Matt Damon were like, why don't you direct it? But I was like, that's awesome, but we need someone good. And so what he did instead, Kevin Smith was one of Miramax's key filmmakers. He'd done two of his three films for Miramax at that point, and they'd been successful. And thus, Kevin Smith had a direct line to now convicted rapist Harvey Weinstein. And so he got the script to Weinstein. Weinstein was a man at this stage who had the power to make this project happen. And Smith told Weinstein to read it. Weinstein did. And his feedback on it was, he had two pieces of feedback for Affleck and Damon, which was, number one, take out a scene that was in the film of them playing chess, and the other was to remove the kissing of nethers. And so this was proof to Affleck and Damon that he'd actually read it. So they signed up with him, and in 1995, Miramax purchased the project from Castle Rock for a low seven-figure sum. But one thing that still was not going to happen, even with Miramax paying the bills, was they're not going to direct the film. In then came an unlikely candidate, Mel Gibson. He'd just made Braveheart at this point. Damon and Affleck hadn't watched it, but a meeting was arranged, and Weinstein urged them to say that they loved Braveheart, because that's the way Hollywood works. And so Gibson was interested, and he worked with it for a number of months before it just wasn't getting anywhere. And so Affleck and Damon, again, they took a gamble. They asked Mel Gibson to let the project go because they were going to get too old to star in it themselves. And so Mel Gibson agreed to do so. Miramax was sending the script then to a few other directors. Gus Van Sant was one of them, but Michael Mann, post Heat, was in the queue and ahead of Van Sant in the queue. Now, he too was interested in directing this, but he too didn't want Matt Damon in the lead role. In fact, he suggested that the lead characters be car thieves. He wanted a few changes to it, and he got as far reportedly as doing some screen tests with Matt Damon, but he just wasn't convinced he could work with Damon in the movie. He didn't think that was the way to go. Miramax, nonetheless, backed Affleck and Damon on this one, and so Michael Mann moved on. Steven Soderbergh was said to have noodled with the idea for a while. Ben Stiller certainly did. He gave an interview to Vulture a couple of years ago where he said, "I remember my agent sent me the script for Good Will Hunting to direct, and I was like, who are these guys, Affleck and Damon, and why are they attached to this project? No thank you." And he says, in retrospect, maybe I'd change that. Now, Gus Van Sant, he'd just had success with the film To Die For, starring Nicole Kidman. Casey Affleck was in that as well. But it was Drugstore Cowboy that was really his calling card. And his name popped up and they were interested. Affleck and Damon liked the idea of him. And so he got in touch through Van Sant as well. He read the script and got in touch via Casey Affleck with Ben Affleck and had a meeting in Los Angeles. And it seemed like finally this was the way forward. Miramax liked it, was okay with the idea of Gus Van Sant. Again, Drugstore Cowboy was pivotal there, apparently. But the film was lingering for a while still, with Van Sant and Weinstein arguing over who would get final cut of the film. But what ultimately put the foot down on the accelerator was Damon in particular. The profile of his acting career was on the up to the point where he landed the lead role in a film based on a John Grisham book. Now, John Grisham books were red hot in Hollywood at this point, thanks to The Firm starring Tom Cruise, and then The Pelican Brief starring Julia Roberts, and A Time to Kill was coming through, and The Rainmaker, which was this particular project, well, Francis Ford Coppola was going to direct that, and Damon got the news to Weinstein that he got the lead in a John Grisham film. Weinstein just saw numbers, just like, yeah, got to push this forward, and in came producer Lawrence Bender, and they got it to the green light. Now, the Francis Ford Coppola connection was also useful to help them land Robin Williams. So let's go back to that role of Sean, the fact that it'd been written for a major supporting role for a named actor. Again, they were thinking of people like De Niro, about Robert Duvall. And at this stage, Williams had just actually made a film with Francis Ford Coppola. This was Coppola, his director for hire phase, really, because he made the film Jack with Robin Williams, which isn't a great movie. And it was an unlikely project for Coppola to take on at this point, as was a John Grisham adaptation, to be fair. But Williams talked to Coppola about Affleck and about the script and about Affleck and Damon, and he was interested. He tried to work with Gus Van Sant. They tried to get a film called The Mayor of Castro Street going that never happened. CAA, Creative Artists Agency, were Williams's agents at the time, and they were recommending he should do this script. And a deal was hammered out that would see Williams get a fee of $3 million for appearing in the film. The ultimate budget of the film was $10 million, to give you an idea of just what a slice that was. But Williams would also, as part and parcel of this was at an era where he's getting 10, 15 million a movie, he would get a portion of the profits as well. He had to fit in shooting a blockbuster movie by the name of Flubber, which it landed in cinemas, it was watched by a few people and disappeared. It made its money. But he, nonetheless, even though his time commitment to Good Will Hunting was relatively limited, he really put in the work to get his research right. He worked with a dialect coach, because this was a film that was going to be set in Boston, and he wanted to master a South Boston Irish accent. He wanted to get the vowel sounds right. And Dave Itzkoff wrote Robin, the definitive biography, and he talks quite a lot about Williams's preparation for his role in Good Will Hunting in there, and just the sheer level of notes that Williams was making just to get into the character of Sean. The rest of the cast, well, Cole Hauser and Casey Affleck soon joined up, but Stellan Skarsgård got sent the script, and he got the professor role. And again, this is one of the pivotal roles, and he was shooting a film with Steven Spielberg at the time called Amistad, but he nonetheless agreed to go to Boston to meet the creative team, and he signed up. There was slightly more trouble trying to find the female lead of the film, Skylar, and the casting was ongoing in New York. They weren't having a lot of luck until the moment that Minnie Driver walked in. Now, Gus Van Sant, Ben Affleck, Matt Damon, they all wanted Minnie Driver in the movie. Harvey Weinstein didn't, because, I mean, I did a podcast with Michael Caton-Jones a few episodes ago where he talked about how Harvey Weinstein made his casting decisions for female leads at that point, and whatever you can imagine isn't a million miles away, sadly. In the case of Good Will Hunting, they all pushed against Weinstein for Minnie Driver, and ultimately he relented. I mean, Driver would go on to get an Oscar nomination for her role, but it was the filmmakers, and it was Affleck and Damon really pushing for her, that helped get her over the line, and I think she's great in the movie. Affleck and Damon then took Williams to the South Boston neighborhood, and it's a pretty well-known story that they took him to a bar called the L Street Tavern, where, I mean, Robin Williams was in town. He's a huge movie star at that point, and they I mean, it was a very lively bar, I think, and Williams just loved it. And the story was that it was him who insisted that they use it as a location in the film, which is what they ultimately did. Even though Williams in particular wasn't in those scenes, it felt nonetheless authentic to the film. I mean, a Boston set film, they're trying to tell that they did use locations of that ilk. Now, that's crucial, because, I mean, when filming began in April 1997, so this is it's taken 3-4 years to get this far. The film was shooting in Toronto. This was the economics of it. This was a low-budget movie, and Canada and its tax breaks, it was a cheap place to film films of this ilk. Now, they only had I think they had just over 2 months to shoot this one. They only had a few weeks with Robin Williams as well, but production was underway. And I mean, Affleck and Damon have told the story of tearing up when the first scene was in the can, that this film that they dreamed and they'd stuck to their guns so much with was finally happening. They went, even though the film did shoot in Toronto, they did go on location, though, to Boston. And again, having Robin Williams in town for the shoot, that brought interest as well. There's a really infamous scene in the film with the park bench. And that park bench, of course, became a focal point for mourning in the aftermath of Williams's tragic death. The scene, as it was filmed, was watched by thousands of people. And the Boston Police Department was hugely helpful in just helping them shepherd the crowds and get the material that they needed. But whenever they went on location in Boston, they drew a crowd, because it was a big novelty, a Robin Williams movie in town. Williams, of course, legendary for his improvisation, and there was room for improvisation in this one. And even though he would work with the script, I mean, there's bits in there. There's "Son of a Bitch Stole My Line" I won't tell you where in the movie is, but that's in particular a contribution of Williams, and a glorious contribution as well. He came up with a little monologue about farting as well, which you'll find in the movie. And Gus Van Sant talked about working with Williams. Again, let's go back to that Dave Itzkoff biography of him. And he says that Robin could be needy for his approval once shooting started, and he never allowed rampant buffoonery to overwhelm his work. And Van Sant said he would go, yeah, boss, was that not good? And I'd say, no, that was great. That was really great. We'd move on. And I'd never really encourage him, said Van Sant, to go beyond. I never said, Robin, I thought you were really going to let it go, like Good Morning Vietnam, like let it go. But I thought maybe that would be the wrong thing to point him towards, because it was really working the way he was doing it. Filming then wrapped up in June of 1997, and this is where the story gradually gained its momentum, because the film had, one thing Miramax was genius for in the 90s was the slow rolling out of movies and building up awards attention. And I don't think it's much secret that if Titanic hadn't been that same year, Good Will Hunting could have had even more awards attention. It opened in December of 1997, and the critical response to the film, on the whole, even though it kind of made points that you know where the film is going, the critical response to it was really strong. In particular, the performances of Robin Williams and Matt Damon and Minnie Driver, they were called out for particular attention. Now, the film opened on December the 5th, 1997, and it a very small release at first, as was the way that the movie went into its opening weekend. It only went on to 7 screens, but it opened at number 13 at the box office with $272,000 on its opening. So the trick would be, could Miramax build the interest in the movie? Could over the subsequent weeks it build up enough that when it expanded the release of the film and it kept it on a limited number of screens for a long time, would people come along? And so just to give you an idea of how slow that rollout was, 4 weeks later, it was still only playing on 150 screens. It was still, it was gathering the necessary word of mouth. And of course, the film had to open in December to qualify for the Oscars. They couldn't leave it until a full January release, which is when the movie was going wide. And in fact, the bit where it was blast off was the weekend of January the 9th to January the 11th, 1998, when all of a sudden the screen count went up by 1,600 to 1,787 screens in the US. A 10 million opening, effectively an opening weekend at that stage for the film. The word of mouth had built that much. And whilst Titanic was number one and would the week it opened, I mean, Titanic was 4 weeks in and making every bit of money as fast as it could be printed. Good Will Hunting would hang around in that chart and would hold its own for a good while. So, I mean, let's just jump forward. You go forward a couple of weeks. Spice World opens at number 2. There's Good Will Hunting still hanging in at number 3. Films like As Good As It Gets are around it. Wag the Dog was around it. The new Great Expectations film opens. Good Will Hunting still hangs around at number 3. And it really, really had legs. Now, the legs, of course, were given extra energy by the fact that the film was gathering a lot of awards attention. That, in particular, the story was around Affleck and Damon, these 20-somethings who'd written this script. And as much as it's deriding the Golden Globes, and not without good reason, the Golden Globes were giving films profile, and Affleck and Damon took home Best Screenplay for Good Will Hunting, and all of a sudden they were the hot favourites to win the Oscar as well. The Screen Actors Guild gave Robin Williams a Best Supporting Actor award, and when it came time for the announcements of the Academy Award nominations, well, there was Good Will Hunting, one of the main contenders, with 9 Oscar nominations in the end. You can tell I'm working this on the fly a little bit, including Best Picture, including Best Director, including Best Actor for Matt Damon. But the two that it would go on to win, and I remember watching this particular Oscar show, and it was quite a night, was Robin Williams won his sole Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for Good Will Hunting. And then Affleck and Damon, later on that same evening, they won their first Oscars, Damon's only Oscar to date, for their screenplay. And their acceptance speech regularly comes around when Oscar highlights clips come around. Now, beyond that, I mean, the film was still bubbling up at the box office, and in fact, for a $10 million movie, it would go on to make $225 million worldwide, of which $138 million, I think, was in the US, and it would go on to be a DVD hit as well, a Blu-ray hit as well, and continues to be a much, much loved film. There wasn't much talk of, for fairly obvious reasons, of a continuation of the story, but I should acknowledge that Kevin Smith did have a bit of fun with it when he came round to Jay and Silent Bob Strikes Back, a film he made a couple of years afterwards, where he did lure Gus Van Sant in for a cameo as they looked to make Good Will Hunting 2 Hunting Season, but that was just confined to the Smith movie. As it stands, Good Will Hunting is, I mean, it's a real highlight in the careers of everyone concerned. Not the highlight, maybe, although it is, perhaps it is, depending on how you view the film. I really love the film an awful lot, but I mean, it was telling that on that awful day when Robin Williams' life ended, that of the films that people came back to, it was Dead Poets Society and it was that Park Bench in Boston that did become a shrine to an extraordinary film talent. I think Good Will Hunting really does stand the test of time. I think there's so much to love in it. And I do think that its endurance is down to a whole number of things, but that Williams performance, that is surely one of them. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. If you can just indulge me telling you a couple of things that I'm up to. I have a Blu-ray coming out, but Film Stories' first ever Blu-ray that we picked up the UK rights in conjunction with David at Plumeria Pictures, who's been working with us on this, for Sneakers. I love Sneakers. The disc will have 3 commentary tracks on it now, I can tell you, as well as a 45-minute exclusive video interview and a rare interview as well with its director Phil Alden Robinson. It's on sale now for release on June the 28th 2021, depending when you're listening to this. It's either on sale now or it's up for pre-order. You can find it at store.filmstories.co.uk. Really proud of the work that we're doing on that. Really proud of our magazines as well. The new issue of Film Stories magazine is deep into production. You can buy all of our back issues at store.filmstories.co.uk, as well as Film Stories Junior, our magazine for younger film fans. If you do like this podcast, one request I always put in: I am an independent podcast producer. Everything from Film Stories is basically generated from a front room. If you do like this podcast, I mean, the reason I'm here is your word of mouth. It's because people subscribe to it. It's because people leave ideally hugely positive reviews. If you'd be willing to do that as well, I would be hugely grateful. But that's enough of me just giving plugs and parish notices, really. Let me get on with the second of the 2 films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. This time I'm going right the way back to 1980. Remember the name of this one?
This is no Mickey Mouse school. You're not getting off easy because you're talented. You work twice as hard. Now, I don't care how well you dance or how cute you are or how many colored tutus you have. If you don't give your academic subjects equal time, you're out.
For Coco, it's the stardom. For Ralph, it's a chance. For Leroy, it's survival. For Lisa, it's the dance.
Bruno, this is our big chance, man. Don't you want success?
They've got nothing in common but a dream.
So you want to be an actor, huh?
Yeah, sure want to be an actor. Judy.
A dream that one day, the whole world will know their name.
Because I'm gonna be a dancer. A good dancer. You know who says so? Me.
A dream of fame. Fame. It's the dream of instant success.
That then, you probably guessed actually, is a clip from Fame from 1980, directed by the late Alan Parker, written by Christopher Gore. A huge cast, so let me get through the names. Eddie Barth, Irene Cara, Lee Carreri, Laura Dean, Antonio Franceschi, Boyd Gaines, Albert Haig, Tracer Hughes, Steve Inwood, Paul McCrane, Anne Meara, Joanna Merlin, Barry Miller, Jim Moody, Jean Anthony Ray and Maureen Teefy are the lead ensemble of this one. It was a bunch of unknowns who came together, and I mean it with no disrespect to suggest that this was the high point of a lot of their careers, but I think it'd be the high point of lots of people's careers. Such was the impact of the movie. However, the story of the film actually began with another musical, a Broadway hit by the name of A Chorus Line that Sir Richard Attenborough would ultimately bring to the screen. But at this stage, it was on stage, and a man called David De Silva, well, at that time, he was a talent manager in New York, and he went to see the show, and in particular, he was taken with a song in the show called Nothing. Now, Nothing was a song that name-dropped the New York High School of Performing Arts. And De Silva thought there's a story there about what students trying to break into show business, about their ambitions, about the rejections they face. What he felt was there's a story to be told before people get to a chorus line. If chorus line is a story of working actors, what about the people fighting to get to that point? So that idea was really forming, and he got in touch with a playwright by the name of Christopher Gore and hired him to write a script, paid him $5,000 for the work. De Silva had already worked out the characters and the rough story, but Gore then went and talked to lots of students, including those at the High School of Performing Arts, and he put together his screenplay, and De Silva then went out to sell it. And again, I mean, for the second time in this episode of the podcast, it was a screenplay that sold really quickly. The MGM bought the film up. It paid $400,000 in 1978 for the privilege of making the film that at this point was called Hot Lunch. The sale was reported in the Hollywood Trade Press in September 1978, and MGM was motoring with it because by the end of that year, it was confirmed that it was on its 1979 production schedule with an eye on releasing the film in 1980. Now, by this stage, British director Alan Parker, who talks about this film extensively, who left a load of material about the film on his website, which I do urge you to check out. Again, I've leaned on quite a few of the resources he put on there. He had come to the attention of Hollywood at that point off the back of 2 films he'd made outside of Hollywood. So he'd done the musical Bugsy Malone in 1976, and then he got Oscar nominated for 1978's Midnight Express, which Oliver Stone wrote and also got Oscar nominated for. Alan Parker got a Best Director Oscar nomination for the film, and so there was obvious interest in Hollywood studios working with him. In fact, 20th Century Fox had inked a 3-picture deal with him, although it wasn't an exclusive one. The deal involved producer David Putnam, who now Lord Putnam, who would go on to, he would go on to run Columbia Pictures at the end of the 1980s, but that is a story and a half. So in this case, Putnam decided to stay and stay with the deal that he had and pursued a film called Chariots of Fire. I wonder what happened to that. But Parker, well, because he wasn't exclusively tied to Fox, he went, when he was sounded out by MGM about doing Fame, he saw something and he said yes and agreed to take it on. And he brought in a British producer by the name of Alan Marshall to come in and take over Putnam's role. Now, as Parker said, having had some success with my previous film, Midnight Express, I was suddenly inundated with Hollywood scripts. He was mentored by the legendary director Fred Zinnemann in the UK, and Zinnemann had described to him quote, the first bounce when you're hot. When you're hot, you get first choice at the hot scripts. When you're less hot, you get the 4th or 5th choice of the scripts, and quote, he describes, quote, the scripts arrived covered in other directors' fingerprints, but this one didn't. And in fact, quite a couple of interesting scripts landed on Parker's desk, and so he and Marshall, they were waiting for a meeting in Los Angeles, and they decided to have a look at 2 of them. Now, one of the scripts was One from the Heart, which ultimately Francis Ford Coppola would make. That was arguably the more refined of the 2 scripts. The other was Hot Lunch. Now, this was raw, this bursting with energy, had a lot of work that needed doing, but also more appeal. At this stage, Parker wanted to make his first film in America, and the idea of doing a New York story, well, that was of real interest. So he arranged a meeting with De Silva that ultimately took place in New York. And Parker described it. He said, we didn't get off to a very good start because after mentioning that I'd like to do the film, he said, I'd like to write my own version of the script and that I'd be making the film with Alan Marshall producing, not him. And he said at this stage that De Silva began to cry. And Parker said, I tried to console him as he blew into his napkin. And at the time, Parker said, it was impossible for me to know that Fame would eventually become De Silva's life's work, occupying the next 30 years during which he would gain his revenge by becoming very rich from the TV and the stage versions of the film. We're coming to that shortly. So what happened then is a deal was struck and Gore and Parker would work on a second draft together. They went to London to do this. De Silva had also visited the High School of Performing Arts in New York as well, so they were aware of the project. One little tidbit I found is MGM just got themselves a little bit of extra cash by selling the novelisation rights to Fame in April 1979. That story made the Hollywood trade. They got £150,000 for that as well. So that's not bad. That offsets some of the $400,000 they spent on getting the script in the first place. But even before the filming was beginning, there was talk of a TV show as well. There was some excitement about this. But Alan Marshall and David De Silva, well, they were a bit chalk and cheese. That De Silva was a more sensitive American producer and Alan Marshall was, let's just charitably say, a less sensitive British producer. And when De Silva mooted the idea of a television show, Marshall reportedly told De Silva to, quote, piss off and take your stupid TV series with you. And Parker would go on to joke that it was one of the most expensive piss-offs in the history of the film industry, given that TV series would become The Kids from Fame, which I'll come to shortly. He did note, and he noted on his website, that Marshall and De Silva didn't really sit side by side very well, but they were all on board, and the project was motoring forward. Parker was involving students from the High School of Performing Arts in New York, and he was talking to them, and he was telling them they'd have the chance to audition, and he was doing his research. But then they started to hit problems, because in March of 1979, a couple of months before production was due to begin, they got got news that they weren't going to be allowed to film at the school itself because that was under the jurisdiction of the New York Board of Education. Now, the New York Board of Education read the script to Hot Lunch and it didn't like it. It didn't like the violence. It didn't like the swearing and didn't like the, quote, overtones of pornography. Now, the overtones of pornography, it's worth noting, probably weren't helped by the fact that around the same time there's a film called Hot Lunch was doing the rounds that was, let's just say, a little bit fruitier than Fame. So MGM, though, I mean, it stood its ground. It stood up to the Board of Education in New York. It was committed at this stage, spending $7-8 million on the movie. And as an article wrote, various contemporary sources, including Dance Magazine and a New York article from May 1980, pointed out the irony that the film offered job opportunities to the students that the Board of Education was trying to help. But the Board of Education was getting in the way of the film to the point where there was a worry it wouldn't be able to shoot in New York. That the board was basically stopping its students getting involved in this project. So the film found itself in a position that it was going to be about New York schools, but the New York board weren't allowing them to use real New York schools. In then came the New York City Mayor's Office of Films, and the director of that at that point was someone called Nancy Littlefield. And so she was far more enthusiastic about bringing this project to New York, and she found 2 abandoned schools in the New York area that were outside of the jurisdiction of the Board of Education. And she said, you can pick either one of those. You can have permits to shoot in Times Square as well. And so the filmmakers chose a school, an abandoned school called Harran High, which MGM then spent a reported £200,000 to turn it basically into a movie studio, a movie studio that carried on working once Fame had been and gone. Now, Parker nonetheless met with the School Board of Education himself and just got no dice. And he recalls this meeting. He says, being asked, does there have to be so much profanity? Snapped a board member, he says, waving a well-thumbed copy of an early draft of our script. No one in our school speaks like this. Alan Marshall was sat by Parker and he turned and whispered to him and said, like truck they do. I've done a bit of rhyming there, chum. See if you can work it out. The film then, well, it had its locations, it had MGM's money, just needed a cast. That was going to be easy, right? A whole bunch of unknowns were needed, and auditions for the film, well, they weren't allowed to take place at the High School of Performing Arts, but crucially, the head of the School of Performing Arts was a man called Richard Klein. He was, again, far keener to support Hot Lunch, and in fact he was the one who recommended to the producers, set the time of your auditions around the lessons and students will then be able to go along. And it was 4 months, the audition process, that it took place across a series of separate auditions that took place in New York Hotel. They saw around 2,000 performers, a lot of them who came from the School of Performing Arts. In fact, it was well known within the school that the auditions were taking place elsewhere in New York, so lots of people went along for them. They went through conventional casting agencies as well. They weren't just looking for unknowns. They were trying anyone. I mean, they talked about how they went through every acting and dance and music school in New York. Parker said his office walls were filled with Polaroids as he tried to get his cast together. I mean, some of the people, there was a rumour that Madonna came by and auditioned, although that was shot down. But people who definitely did were the likes of Steve Buscemi. His audition was apparently 30 seconds at most. Patrick Swayze, Tom Cruise, Michelle Pfeiffer. But the cast gradually came together. And in fact, of the 8 lead roles, only one of them would ultimately come from the school. That was Laura Dean. But they used extras extensively from amongst the student body. Now, one notable member of the cast was Irene Cara. She was originally brought in as a dancer, but then they heard her sing. And so they rewrote the role of Coco in the film. For her, they beefed the part up. She would ultimately be asked to sing the eventual title song as well as one of the other numbers in there, and it was a complete career launcher for her. Parker also talked about other influences that led him to rewrite the film. So he talked about how the students took him along to a midnight rerun of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, where he said, I watched them reenact the whole show dressed as the movie characters, squirting pistols in the air when it rained, answering back to the screen. And he described it as great spontaneous theatre that I had to include in the film. And so that was written in as well. The draft as they came to shooting apparently came in at 171 pages. pages, which by Hollywood parlance equates to 2 hours 51 minutes of screen time. So that was going to be edited down. Michael Gore and Dean Pitchford were hired for the music. Some of the songs were actually laid down and recorded before filming began, but the film was still called Hot Lunch at this point. So the song Fame, the crucial song Fame, that hadn't even been conceived at that point. Louis Falco was hired to choreograph the film. He had 6 weeks in all to rehearse the dancers for the movie, and in all there was 4 months of physical preparation with the actors in getting that studio together before they were ready to go. Filming did begin in the end in the summer of 1979, and it was going to be an 18-week planned shoot starting in the school holidays when students were free to do what they wanted. They didn't have to ask permission from school if it was in the school holidays. They did an extra week of rehearsals beforehand. But what was interesting here is Parker basically established the techniques he would then use on the commitments, which I've covered in a previous episode of Film Stories. He'd watch his young ensemble, even as the film was coming together. He would be willing to shape the roles around them a little. Now, he would confess that he wasn't keen on all of the cast of this one, and he would also say that he found it a lot easier doing the commitments working with an Irish cast rather than an American cast. He just found slightly easier, but still he was working with the actors. The performances were coming in, and when filming began on 9th of June 1979, it was ready to rock and roll. Now, it was fairly soon after filming began, the film got its new name, drawn from a David Bowie song. And what really led them down the road of having to change it was they also learnt that Hot Lunch was not just a fruity movie, it was also apparently New York slang for a naughty act as well, which I've definitely not looked up and definitely won't be telling you about. Inevitably, one of the most difficult sequences, if you've not seen the film, you may just have seen the clip of this, was a huge dance scene that takes place outside on the street. This scene alone, this whole sequence took 3 days to shoot. There are 8 choreographed routines in it, 160 background actors, 50 professional dancers in there, and the dancing goes on to the song Fame. But when they came to shoot it, they didn't have the song Fame. So by this point, the film had certainly changed its name, but the title song wasn't ready. And so when they shot that outdoor dance sequence, they actually did it to the song Hot Stuff by Donna Summer, because they didn't have any other title track to go on. Now, the fact that they were shooting this out on a very, very busy New York street meant they got traffic snare-ups. The city was, the weather was piping hot as well, but they were causing congestion. They got a lot of complaints. And by the second and third day of shooting of this sequence, they're having to work to a 4 p.m. curfew, and they weren't getting on the right side of the locals. Now, one of the offshoots of listening to Hot Stuff by Donna Summer for 3 days that's what inspired Michael Gore to write the new song that would lead the film, the song Fame. And he found an empty music room at the abandoned school, sat at the piano and came up with the song. Now, his singing voice wasn't particularly good, and so when he played it for Alan Parker at first, Parker said, "I consequently thought the new song was pretty awful. I'm going to live forever, baby, remember my name," shouted Gore with gusto. "Oh boy, I thought, who would listen to that?" But what they decided to do was, let's try the song with someone who can sing. And so in came Irene Cara to sing it, and Parker says, "Before my hasty judgment committed it to the outtray, suffice to say that it came out a lot better in the studio." The shoot was long and hot and problematic, though. It was an incredibly hot summer, and Parker was a British director working in America for the first time, coming up against American unions for the first time. And he wanted to use the British crew that he'd worked with on his previous 2 movies, but that jarred with the American unions. And it took quite a lot of negotiating to get any kind of resolution on this. I think one of the conditions was Parker had to use an American cinematographer in the future. But a deal was ultimately struck that saw American crew and British crew working on the film. Then there were little things as well, because I mean, Parker would note that he found British crews to work faster, but also he talked about using smoke in scenes sometimes to diffuse the light on his previous 2 films. And Parker says traditionally incense burners were used to puff the soft smoke into the air to catch the shafts of light, but this presented problems for some of the New York crew who were steadfastly set in in their ways, and they weren't allowed to use these incest burners. They were absolutely insistent, and thus they couldn't. Any kind of smoke was ultimately forbidden, much to Parker's unhappiness. Parker then, there's a lovely passage on his website. He said, "A new word was introduced to me on this film, grandstanding." And he describes it thus. He said, "This was when personnel from each department let it be known that it was now their moment in the sun. Jobs that were quietly and invisibly performed in England for the show suddenly were the show. This was usually led by the diva-ish sound department, who, dressed in their T-shirts proclaiming 'My dad's kid won an Oscar,' regularly took over the entire set with great pomp to lay down their microphone traps." Now, one thing, Parker did speak to some of the advantages of an American crew, and also he changed the culture a little bit on the film, because at the end of each day, he would screen the daily footage, known as the dailies, and he would let the whole crew come in to watch that. And that wasn't how things were done at that stage on American productions, primarily, that it would just be a couple of people and it would be very closed, and it was seen as a bit of a privilege. But he wanted to be a bit more inclusive on that. Filming would ultimately wrap up in either late October, early November 1979. Parker had tried to keep to a 5-day working week for the bulk of it as well, so he could spend time with family, and just that sounded like a more orderly way to make a film, really. Actually having time off during, who would have thunk it? The film would be released ultimately in May of 1980, and this was a tough one to release, because they were unknowns. There were no stars. There was Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back was coming out not long afterwards. This was going to require some word of mouth to get people interested. That at this stage, MGM, the cost of the film was $8.5 million in the end, which is a reasonable amount of money for 1980. But when the film came out, the reviews were generally quite positive. Not everyone was particularly happy with it. But one thing that was particularly praised, I've always found this about Fame, is it really goes to the darker edges of some of the stories. It doesn't hide away from that. MGM put a lot into the promotion. It put $2 million of extra marketing spend into this, a lot of money at that time, laid on free preview screenings, got the word of mouth going, and combined with the critical response to the film, it got its opening. And the film, a different era for box office openings. It opened in May of 1980 on 3 screens, actually, at first. $118 million. A film called The Long Riders was the one that opened at the top. A film about Jesse James was top of the box office that week. It was a couple of weeks later that Fame would find itself up against Star Wars Episode 5, as it wasn't known then. The Empire Strikes... Well, it was, but not in the title. It was The Empire Strikes Back came out, and that blasted straight to number 1. But Fame had its word of mouth. Now, hugely detailed box office statistics are hard to find for that particular era, but it would go on to do $20 million or so in the US, a sizable return for MGM. Total worldwide box office $42 million, but it was starting to print money. The soundtrack was a sensation for a start, but also within 3 weeks of the film hitting, news of a spin-off TV series was announced. Parker and Marshall were not involved, but the film, The Kids from Fame, would use some of the cast, and it would go on to be a huge success. It would earn hundreds of $millions across the multiple seasons that it ran. It went into syndication in America, and to go back to what was said before, it was a very expensive piss off. Parker and Marshall were not beneficiaries of the impact of the show and the finances of the show, because MGM insisted as part of the deal, those aren't the residuals that your contract entitled them to. So Parker's limit and Marshall's limit was just the movie. De Silva cannily had also kept hold of the stage rights when he negotiated his deal for Fame. That would prove rather lucrative as well, that a Fame stage show would follow, and that would go on to make an awful lot of money. And this whole idea that he had while watching a chorus line went on to make him a millionaire many, many times over. Now, Fame also interested the Oscars, that it was up for, in the end, 6 awards, although it was up against itself in one of the categories. So it got Best Original Screenplay Oscar for Christopher Gore's script, film editing as well. It won for the best score by Michael Gore, but also it had 2 songs nominated, Fame and Out Here on My Own, and it was Fame ultimately that prevailed there. 2 Oscars in its bag, and a box office success, and a hit TV show, and ultimately a stage sensation as well. It was the first film in history to have 2 songs nominated from the same film in the best song category at the Oscars. Disney would make an art of that about a decade later, and that ultimately would have been the end of the story, apart from the fact that a remake came along. This was 2009, something like that, and Alan Parker would give an interview about that film to the Daily Telegraph when the people behind the new Fame suggested that they had Alan Parker's blessing for the film. They did not have Alan Parker's blessing for the film, and he told the Telegraph that he'd not been consulted and was appalled by the, quote, dreadful project. He said, "It's a bit like being mugged. Such are the realities of Hollywood manners and American copyright law. I've never had a single phone call from anyone, the studio, the producers, about this remake. No one spoke to me about it. To say so is absolute nonsense." And as Parker would say, "I feel very much that Fame is mine. I spent months with the kids at the school, then spent a year making the movie. You do the work and make it as good as it can be, and you try to protect it." And he did look at legal action over use of the Fame logo in the film, because apparently the studio didn't have the rights for that. But interesting, if you go on Parker's website, and he's left behind an incredible resource there, when he talks about that, the Fame logo changes, well, the letter F changes to the letter L. You can fill in the gap there. Parker, of course, left us a few years ago, and 2 or 3 hugely successful musical films to his name. I will come to Evita in a future podcast. Fame, at the point this has been recorded, is 41 years old. He's still being watched. It's got a good Blu-ray release as well. And you know what? Considering the title song was all about Remember My Name, I don't think anyone is in a rush, really, to forget it. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, I've waffled on too long. So if you want more of my waffling, I'm on Twitter at Simon Brew. If you want to support this podcast and get episodes early as well, patreon.com/Simon Brew is where you can do that. I put funds from that also into giving new writers a break on the website, which is filmstories.co.uk, where we have all sorts of film stories on there as well. You can buy all of the Film Stories magazines and Blu-ray. If I mentioned the Blu-ray, store.filmstories.co.uk. On Facebook, facebook.com/filmstories. Online, youtube.com/Film Stories. I think that's enough from me though for this week, isn't it? I've waffled on and I've waffled on and I've waffled on, and I'm going to stop waffling. The most important thing, as always, is you all take care and look after yourselves and stay safe. I'll be back soon with some more Film Stories. Bye bye.
It's not your fault.